At the average credit card APR of 22.30%, a responsible minimum payment can quietly turn a $5,000 balance into $12,847 in interest before it's finally gone. And the brutal part is the payment feels like progress, because the statement thanks you for paying on time. But here's what nobody tells you. The minimum is designed to protect the bank's profit math, not your finish line. If you've ever thought, at least I'm handling it, and then wondered why the balance barely moves, that's the trap. So why does paying the minimum feel responsible while your payoff date drifts further away? In a minute, you'll see the exact mechanism that makes the balance shrink slowly while the interest keeps eating the calendar. And right now, with rates sitting above 22% on average, this illusion is more expensive than most people realize. Let's break down the minimum payment psychology that keeps smart people stuck. Meet Maya. She carries $5,042 on a card at 24% APR, and every month she pays exactly what the statement asks. Her banking app flashes green check marks, her credit score doesn't scream, and she tells herself she's being disciplined. Then she notices something unsettling. After a full year, her balance is still basically a few thousand. Daniel has a different story but the same ending. He makes more money than he used to, yet his card never seems to disappear. He calls it floating expenses because the balance feels like it's just hovering, not growing, not shrinking. And Sam, the most cautious of the three, pays the minimum plus a little extra, then rewards himself for being good. Sound familiar? You pay, you breathe, you promise yourself you'll attack it when life calms down. But it gets worse, because the minimum payment changes in a way your brain interprets as improvement, even when it isn't. First, the plain language version, the minimum is often so low it mostly covers interest, not the original purchase. That's why you can pay for months and still feel like you're staring at the same number. Then comes the label, this is present bias, the tendency to prefer small relief now over a bigger payoff later. The statement offers relief on a schedule, and your brain learns the habit, paid just enough to stop the discomfort. Now zoom in on how minimums are calculated, because this is where the illusion is engineered. Many issuers use formulas like a percentage of the balance or a small percentage plus interest and fees, which keeps the required payment low while stretching the timeline. Typical minimums often land around 1 to 3% of the balance, or a small floor like $15, $40, whichever is higher. So the system doesn't ask, how fast do you want this gone? It asks, what's the smallest number that keeps this account current? And because that smallest number is framed as official, it becomes an anchor your brain's default reference point. Anchoring bias is why minimum due feels like the correct amount, even when you know it's not the best outcome. It's like a treadmill with a speed dial you didn't set. You're moving, but you're not going anywhere. And here's where it gets interesting. The minimum payment tends to drop as the balance drops, which can slow your progress exactly when you think you're winning. Watch Maya's month. She pays, the balance nudges down, and next statement her minimum is slightly smaller. Her brain reads that as success, because smaller required payments feel like the problem is shrinking. But smaller payments also mean less principal gets hit. So the finish line slides outward. This is the compound interest blindness piece. Most people feel interest as a monthly fee, not as a long timeline tax. At 24% APR, the monthly interest rate is about 2%, which means a $5,000 balance can generate roughly $100 in interest before you even touch principal. So when a minimum payment is, say, 2% of the balance, a big chunk of it can get consumed by interest, especially early on. Now add loss aversion. People hate feeling like they're losing money, so they avoid bigger payments that make the checking account drop. The statement quietly offers a pain minimizing option, and it's labeled as compliance, not delay. Daniel's pattern shows the next layer. Lifestyle inflation. As he earns more, spending rises with it. And the card becomes a shock absorber for months when reality doesn't match the new normal. That's why I'll pay it off when I get ahead can run for years, because ahead keeps moving. And if you've ever said, at least I'm not missing payments, you're not alone, because the system trains that as the primary success metric. A major survey even found 49% of Americans said credit card debt feels normal, which changes what your brain considers urgent. When something is normal, it stops triggering alarm, even if it's expensive. Here's the part that surprised a lot of people. Minimum payments are built to avoid obvious disaster, not to optimize your payoff time. Federal guidance discourages negative amortization, meaning the minimum generally won't be below the interest that's accruing, but that still leaves plenty of room for a painfully slow payoff. So the minimum is like a guardrail, not a route. Now the compounding kicks in on a different dimension: time. The longer the balance exists, the more opportunities interest has to stack up, especially when the payment stays anchored near the minimum. But here's what changes everything. The minimum payment trap isn't just math, it's a behavioral loop with rewards, relief, and identity. Maya's identity is responsible, so she avoids anything that would contradict that story. Paying the minimum keeps her identity intact because she's following the rules the bank printed in bold. This is status quo bias. Once you're in a pattern that prevents immediate pain, changing it feels risky, even when it's rational. And the credit card statement is a powerful piece of framing. It shows a minimum due in giant type, while the long-term cost is quiet or buried. Even when statements include warnings, your brain still grabs the shortest instruction first. Pay this by this date. Hold on to that thought, because the next part explains why this loop can survive even in people who are good with money elsewhere. When Sam pays the minimum plus a little extra, he gets the psychological reward of being better than minimum. But the reward is immediate, while the payoff improvement is invisible, so the behavior locks in even if the timeline barely changes. That's the core of delayed feedback. Your effort doesn't feel proportional to the outcome, so motivation decays. And when motivation decays, the default anchor takes over again. Now zoom out to the money numbers people rarely picture. Average household credit card balances have been reported around $11,019, which means millions of people are paying for time, not purchases. If your balance is smaller than that, it doesn't mean you're safe from the mechanism. It just means the same mechanism is running on a smaller scale. So why does the $12,847 mistake happen specifically? Because when you pay the minimum on a high APR balance, you can spend years paying interest on yesterday's spending, even as you keep living today. The interest becomes background noise, and background noise is where expensive habits hide. Here's a fast pattern interrupt. Imagine your card balance is a leaking bucket. The minimum payment is a cup that's just big enough to keep the floor from flooding, but not big enough to empty the bucket. And every month the bank quietly adjusts the cup size so you feel like you're improving, while the leak keeps running. This is where it clicks. The minimum payment is optimized for continuity, keeping the account active, not for closure. So what does this mean for you? The real risk isn't being irresponsible, it's believing the minimum represents progress. Once you see the mechanism, you start noticing the subtle signals that the loop is active. One signal is the emotional reset. You pay, you feel relief, then you stop thinking about the balance until the next statement. Another signal is language. I'm managing it replaces I'm finishing it, and your brain treats those as the same goal. Another is the shrinking minimum. The bill looks smaller, so urgency fades, even if the timeline expands. And another is the invisible interest. You remember the payment, but not how much of it was the cost of time. This is why. Compound interest isn't just a finance term, it's a perception problem. People picture compounding as something that helps savers, but on debt, it's the same engine running in reverse. And with APRs over 22% on average, that reverse engine is strong enough to turn small delays into big totals. If you felt a weird shame about being stuck, zoom out. The loop is designed to feel normal and manageable, not alarming. That's not an excuse, it's a clue, because shame hides patterns and clarity exposes them. So the resolution isn't a hack, it's a reframing. Minimum due is a status marker, not a strategy. A cleaner way to think about it is this. The statement is telling you what keeps the account in good standing, not what ends the cost. When you separate staying current from getting free, the illusion loses a lot of its power. And that's the callback to the $12,847 mistake. It's not one bad decision. It's hundreds of tiny responsible payments that quietly buy time at 24%. Drop a comment if you've ever watched a balance barely move and thought, how is this still here? I break down financial psychology like this every week, focusing on the patterns that feel normal until you name them. If this clicked for you, there's more where this came from. Next time, I'm diving into the credit limit mirage, why a higher limit can feel like safety while it actually increases. Your risk of staying stuck,